Today, I'm joined by Justin Miller, a partner and national director of wealth planning at Evercore Wealth Management and Evercore Trust Company, to discuss the movie The Hangover. As if we were roaming a Las Vegas buffet and trying a little bit of everything, Justin and I cover a multitude of topics, including generation skipping transfer tax issues, asset protection, income tax residency versus domicile, and other prudent estate planning considerations. What are some common mistakes when preparing GST trusts? Just as importantly, what is Justin's connection to Bradley Cooper? We explore these questions and more, so let's jump in, as you never walk away from the table when you're on a heater. Welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. I'm Hans Young, a family wealth partner at Farella. Through this podcast, my guests and I will provide an entertaining look at family wealth and estate planning topics through well-known Hollywood movies. Each episode will focus on a single movie as we discuss fun facts, review our favorite scenes, and engage in thought-provoking discussions of real-world legal issues. And lastly, do you agree with our verdict? Is the movie a guilty pleasure or just not guilty? Again, welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film. Well, I'm excited to have Justin Miller as my guest on the podcast today. Justin is a partner and national director of wealth planning at Evercore Wealth Management and Evercore Trust Company. He also is an adjunct professor at Golden Gate University, a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and a fellow of the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel. In addition, Justin has written 2 children's novels titled The Super Secret Special Powers Club and The Mysterious Mystery Man. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Hans, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I also have to mention, this is almost surreal for me that Hans was a student of mine in the LLM program about 15 years ago. He's now a partner at a big firm. It's an honor to be on this podcast with you. It makes me feel old, but I'm very happy to be here.
No, thank you so much. It was an income tax of trust and estates class. I'll never forget that. Here we are 15 years later discussing this movie. So again, really appreciate you joining me. When we were recently talking about possible movie ideas, you pretty quickly suggested this one, maybe perhaps thinking I would pass on it. But I was quick to agree because I think the movie and its characters provide us with a lot of great material for a fun and interesting discussion. Before we get to the many estate planning issues we wanted to highlight today, let's start with some fun facts about the movie. So the movie released on June 5th, 2009. It was a major box office success, grossing, I think it's $469 million worldwide on a budget of only $35 million. Became the highest grossing R-rated comedy in the U.S. at that time. Its massive success led to The Hangover Part 2 in 2011, which topped that. So it grossed $587 million, breaking the first film's record. And then it also led to The Hangover Part 3 in 2013. The plot of this movie was inspired by a real event that happened to a friend of one of the executive producers for this movie. The friend went missing from his own Vegas bachelor party, blacked out, and woke up with a very expensive bill to pay. That was the inspiration for the premise of this movie. Directed by Todd Phillips, who supposedly structured his compensation so that he owns a portion of the film's intellectual property. Reportedly, he's made $75 million from the film and subsequent DVD sales, if the internet's to be believed. Last thing I'll say here before I talk about my connection to the film is the movie significantly boosted the careers of all of the primary cast members, like Bradley Cooper, Ed Helms, Zach Galifianakis, and even Ken Jeong, all of whom were relatively unknown at that time, or at least weren't household names. And they've all gone on to do, bigger and better things. A few years later, Bradley Cooper starring in Silver Linings Playbook with Robert De Niro, American Hustle, Guardians of the Galaxy. So certainly a good career choice for them. I actually didn't watch this movie in the theater. I saw it on TV while on vacation, really enjoyed it, and then immediately understood why everyone had been talking about it for probably the year or so before I actually saw it. I think this movie really captures what many people imagine as the ultimate Vegas weekend in terms of the fun and antics that can happen there, which obviously resonated with audiences because I think for most people, their real Vegas experience is nothing like this movie. When did you watch this movie for the first time, and what is your connection to it?
So I probably did not see this in the theaters either, but certainly once it came out on video. And that's partly where you mentioned Todd Phillips getting a lot of the money also came from DVD sales. Mm-hmm. So that, not as big nowadays. We have streaming and everything.
That's right. Yeah.
Like that. But what really resonated for me is, and that I think special about this movie isn't just, I mean, at the time it came out, I had two little kids, so there wasn't a lot of going to theaters at the time. But what's really special is this is one of those rare movies that not only did I enjoy, my wife enjoyed it. And eventually, once my kids were old enough, they're now, graduate school and college, but they love this movie. I mean, it's very rare that multiple generations can enjoy a movie like this. Now, I wouldn't recommend it for anything younger than a teenager. It's a really special movie that I think appeals to a lot of different people in different generations.
You had mentioned, and maybe you want to get to this later, but you mentioned you having a 1975 connection to some of maybe the people involved in this movie. I'm curious to hear what that's about.
Yeah, so I might as well. I already posted it on LinkedIn, so I think everyone knows. I turned 50 this year, so it's 50 years old. But a fun fact for me personally is that Bradley Cooper was also born in 1975. And there were a couple other people, but I mean, so this could have just as easily been me in this film.
That's right.
Except for maybe Bradley Cooper's looks and acting ability. I mean, I was very likely could have been the next choice, but no, not only Bradley Cooper at 1975 as a birth date, but one of the co-screenwriters, John Lucas, who co-wrote it with Scott Moore. He was born in 1975. And then another interesting story is those were the original two screenwriters. They get screenwriting credit. But this script was significantly rewritten, which happens in Hollywood a lot. You sell your script. And it was rewritten by Todd Phillips, who was the director, and Todd's partner, Jeremy Gerlich. And Jeremy was also born in 1975. So there's a lot of people now that are all 50 years old, just like me, that were involved in this movie. We all came around at the same time. But I will point out one other issue, just because we have, we work with lots of lawyers and accountants. What's interesting, I mentioned Jeremy Gerlich and Todd Phillips, who did a significant rewrite of the script. And so they're the ones that added in Mike Tyson's Tiger. I'm sure we'll get to that. The baby Carlos or baby Tyler, whose name changes. The police cruiser, a lot of the best parts of this movie. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure it was a great, solid script. It was made better by these two people. That those two people, though, Todd Phillips and Jeremy Gerlich, do not get screenwriting credit. There was a big issue with the Writers Guild of America, and John Lucas and Scott Moore are the only people credited as screenwriters. And it's a way of protecting. The argument is it's a way of protecting these powerful producers or directors from sort of taking credit for other people's work. So it's a shame. In this case, the original screenwriters actually were willing to give credit because of the significant rewrite. But the Writers Guild declined. So you won't hear their names, although they did a lot of work on the script.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I love that you've now, in a sense, you've written yourself into their story. So a couple of additional fun facts about the movie. The Caesar's Palace Villa that the characters end up in and ultimately trash doesn't really exist, at least not in that exact version. It was a set built at the Warner Brothers studio in California. The Doug song that Stu, Ed Helms' character, plays at the piano was completely improvised by Ed, as was the Zach Galifianakis ditty, Three Best Friends. And, and of all the facts I found, this one perhaps was the most interesting to me, is that no effects or prosthetics were used for Stu's missing tooth. Apparently, Ed Helms' adult incisor never grew in, so his fake incisor was taken out for the parts of filming where Stu's tooth is missing. And I do remember when I was watching it, and even on the rewatch, thinking, how did they do that? It looked so real because it was real.
And it was great. And what couldn't have worked out better, Stu's the dentist. That's his career in the movie. So it's just crazy to think, and that was
exactly
there. Would a dentist be able to pull out his own tooth? And it just kind of worked out perfectly. He was missing the tooth anyway. But yeah, That's a crazy fact.
And then, as you mentioned earlier, the tiger that is in the movie apparently was a real tiger owned by Mike Tyson that was used for filming. Also, a real taser or stun gun was originally going to be used in the stun gun scene, but Warner Brothers attorneys demanded that the crew use a prop. I love that the attorneys were like, absolutely not when it came to the stun gun or taser, but we're completely fine with a live tiger roaming the set. So that was interesting. Any other facts you'd like to add or that you found?
No, I think it's a great start. It's just amazing how much went into this movie. The facts you shared are great. They're so unique. This is the beauty of the internet. I don't think we would have ever heard of any of these things
That's right.
without a simple Google search or something like that.
And on the other end, I guess because of the ease of accessing this information, I always say, who knows if any of the things I've just said are true or not? They sound true, and I like to believe that they are. But let's get to our favorite scene, and I'll give you several contenders here. There's the checking in at Caesar's Palace scene. There's the rooftop toast. There's the morning after. So when they wake up in the hotel suite with no memory of the night before, and that really is what sets the tone for the rest of the movie and sets the premise. There's the return to an attack at the best little chapel where Stu and Jade got married. There's the police station stun gun demonstration after the guys get arrested. There's a scene where Mr. Chow jumps out of the trunk and attacks Phil, Stu, and Alan. Mike Tyson showing up at the hotel suite to get his tiger back. And then there's Alan's blackjack montage where he wins, I think, in the aggregate, $82,400. And then there's which I thought was really neat, the closing credits photo montage, which, I mean, I think ending credits now, and then especially in the time since with Marvel movies and using, hiding Easter eggs or like that sort of, that last scene after the credits, that's sort of more commonplace now. I don't remember if up until that point, closing credits were made to be interesting like that. They probably were. It probably wasn't the first time, but one of the more memorable times for me to sort of, see all the photos and you're filling in all the gaps in the movie as the credits are rolling. So those are the contenders. Which of those was your favorite scene? And perhaps you have one that's not one of those.
Well, first I'll start with those were all great scenes. For anyone listening who hasn't seen the movie or you haven't seen it in a while, you forget how many classic, hilarious scenes there are in this movie. But Hans, I would have to start with my favorite. I think it sets the whole tone for the movie is the scene where they wake up the next morning at the Caesar's Palace Hotel in Las Vegas. And it just beyond imagining everything that could go wrong went wrong. I mean, it is just, and you can feel what these individuals are going through. This suite is completely trashed. Like it looks like worse than any group of, famous rock stars could do, trashing a room. I mean, there's this random chicken that's going around and clucking. There's a chair that's smoldering. Smoke is coming off it. This is where we find out Stu's randomly missing a tooth. There's this dangerous, they open the bathroom. There's a tiger, a real life tiger in the bathroom. Oh, there's a random baby in the room. No one knows who this baby is. I mean, all of those things. I don't know who came up with all of these things, but I could not imagine sort of a worse situation waking up in a room anywhere. And I think that just sets the tone for the whole movie.
I think that's right. Completely agree. Even as you're running through it, such a classic scene. I think that has to be the top one. I mean, just for the sake of some variety here, I will say that the police station stun gun demonstration scene was really great. Just seeing each of them. And I think I'm forgetting the actor's name, but the one who he's been in a couple other comedies. I think he was in Step Brothers and things like that. But he plays the police officer who's actually firing the stun gun and things. But he gives this over the top performance that I think we'd end up knowing him for kind of. But yeah, just seeing that Zach Galifianakis's character having a showdown with that random child. Just an awesome scene. And then I think the other one I had was the check-in at Caesar's Palace, while pretty short. I love that scene. I mean, Alan, that's where he says when they're, this isn't the real Caesar's Palace, is it? And he's like, did Caesar really live here? And just, I think it sets the tone for all those characters too. You kind of get a sense of who they are right there, right? Stu's over there saying, I can't use my credit card, even though he clearly can afford it because His girlfriend checks his credit card statements, which is a fact I think we'll come back to. Doug is there just being a nice guy, which I think that's mostly what he was there to be. And then Phil, Bradley Cooper's character, is aggressively trying to get this villa and get an upgraded room, but he's obviously not wanting to pay for it at all. So anyway, that was probably my next two runner-up scenes.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think you're thinking, so Rob Riggle was the
that's right.
actor who's actually former military. So he plays the police officer role and getting back. I mean, the stun gun scene, some of those scenes are just rolling on the floor laughing type. I think that's probably where that saying comes from. I mean, they literally have the students use stun guns on real life people. So that was crazy. The other thing that you mentioned, the checking in at Caesars, and you have that great quote from Alan, this isn't the real Caesar's Palace, is it? It's not just that Alan plays a guy who's somewhat, that, he doesn't even realize it's not the real Caesar's Palace, but it's his confidence, the way he delivers it. I mean, Zach Galifianakis, this is what made him famous. It was the way he prefaced the question. He goes to the receptionist and says, hey, you probably get this a lot, but this isn't the real Caesar's Palace, is it? and then, by the way, he doesn't drop it. The poor woman looks at him and says, like, oh, what do you mean? And so the next comment's even better. He goes, did Caesar live here? So it's just that lack. But to him, he plays it off. He's so deadpan. He's so serious in how he delivers. It just adds to the hilarity of the moment.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, let's move on to our estate planning opportunities. This is our substantive discussion about, legal issues and estate planning issues we spotted. But since this movie is set in Las Vegas and in honor of the beloved Las Vegas buffet, we're going to discuss a number of estate planning topics today because, well, when you're at a good buffet, you have to get a little bit of everything. So to start it off, we're going to be focusing on Sid, who is played by the great Jeffrey Tambor. This is Tracy and Alan's father. And he's really only in the movie for a couple of scenes in the beginning and I think towards the end for the wedding. But he appears at least to be a high net worth individual. He's married. He's got adult children, perhaps even grandchildren in the near future since Tracy's getting married to Doug. We know that. He's got a large home. He owns a classic car. He throws this elaborate wedding for Tracy. We wanted to look at, gifts, estate, and generation skipping transfer, so GST tax savings, and asset protection for Sid and his family. I think we can at least say at the very minimum, we were advising Sid and his family, he should get a foundational core estate plan done. For the sake of time, we won't go back through what those documents are. I did walk through what a foundational estate plan entails in the Top Gun Maverick episode, so feel free to listen to that if you want a recap of those things. But I was going to ask, what might we suggest for Sid if we were advising him to achieve, both tax savings as well as perhaps some asset protection for him and his family?
Well, I'll start with first. What I love about this podcast is we're taking a movie, The Hangover, this R-rated comedy that has what seems like nothing to do with estate planning, but we're going to turn it into an estate planning lesson. So just that alone, it's a great place to start. But right off the bat, you had mentioned, so we've got this father, Sid. He's planning the wedding for his daughter. He has two children. His daughter's about to get married, and he has a son there, Alan. And so clearly, it looks like it's a wealthy family. We don't know how much. We don't know, is this but it looks fairly wealthy just by the house and the the wedding that's being planned. So let's just assume they are a wealthy family and they've got not only want to protect assets and do your basic documents, and we don't have to go through. Everyone should have your basic estate planning documents. But if there's enough wealth there and you have potential estate taxes, we're talking about right now a 40% estate tax once you get above the exemption amount, and let alone estate taxes, you have GST or generation skipping transfer when it goes to the next generation. What happens if his daughter eventually has kids one day? So there's going to be planning done because there's another 40% potential GST tax if it goes to future grandkids. How do we protect those assets from estate taxes, from GST taxes? We'll get to asset protection in general. And so right off the bat, first thing I would say is Sid better have a good attorney. Hopefully he has a good wealth manager as well. But this is not something he's going to want to do on his own. This is something that takes good professionals to help. But right off the bat, if he just leaves this money, and eventually in a future episode, he actually does, or a future hangover, he actually does pass away. But you want to get your plan in place while you're still alive, while you still have capacity. And you don't necessarily want those assets just going outright to Tracy or Alan. And that's where trusts come in. And I'll turn it back to you for where would you start from a planning perspective?
First of all, probably having them understand just the basics of how, and you kind of walk through a little bit of how the estate and gift tax works. But every individual has a lifetime gift and estate tax exemption of $13.99 million as of 2025. That's going to be set to increase to $15 million and then index for inflation starting in 26. And they also have an annual exclusion amount, which is $19,000 per recipient per year at the moment. And so, as you mentioned, if his assets exceed his lifetime exemption of about $14 million, and he's married, so he would combine that amount. So he really has about, as a family with his wife, $28 million or so. If he's in excess of that, assets are going to be taxed at his death at 40% estate tax. And so the understanding of that and just this general objective that he should leverage his exemption, right, to make either outright gifts, and there's pros and cons to that approach, or he should transfer assets by gift, and there's strategies where you can even implement a sale to irrevocable trusts for the benefit of his desired beneficiaries. And typically, and presumably, that's going to be his descendants, Tracy and Alan, any grandchildren, and perhaps other family members. So I think it starts with having them understand those basic concepts. There are so many different strategies that he can employ, but in general, right, he would be utilizing estate planning strategies to essentially, quote, freeze his estate, because what he's doing is transferring assets into a trust that is not taxable to him for estate tax purposes. And he would be shifting that future appreciation of those assets out of his taxable estate. And then that would either mitigate or potentially even eliminate his estate tax exposure. And so I think it would be probably starting out with exploring what his assets are, understanding what makes up his estate, because different asset classes may lend themselves to different, more appropriate strategies. And then it's probably putting together some type of irrevocable trust or two or three. And there's a number of different flavors there that, I think in future episodes here, we will dive into more deeply. But the other tax that he should understand is the generation skipping transfer tax. So this is a federal tax, and we call it the GST tax for short. It's a federal tax on transfers of wealth to a quote unquote skip person, or someone who's typically at least two generations younger than the transferor. And a grandchild is sort of the typical skip person. And so this tax was enacted to prevent wealthy individuals from avoiding estate taxes by gifting their assets to their grandchildren or great-grandchildren rather than their children. Because if the IRS would have it their way, we know that they would probably want to tax everybody at every generational level. Well, some people got fairly wise that started skipping their own children so that they could essentially avoid one generation worth of tax. And so the IRS put a cap on that. So the current 2025 GST exemption, it's a little bit confusing because it's also $13.99 million. So the same number as your estate tax exemption. But that is what allows you to skip. The IRS basically allows you to skip a generation on an earmark certain assets to do that, but only up to that exemption amount. So assets, the beauty of this is that assets that are then GST exempt and have this exemption allocated to it, if the trusts are structured appropriately, they will avoid estate tax in the descendants' estates. And so that's very valuable. So just with understanding the impact of the estate tax on Sid's estate potentially, as well as his children and future descendants' estates, basically leveraging this GST exemption, we would probably be exploring ways to use the exemption to fund irrevocable trusts. We believe here he lives in California, but if he didn't, there might be a state estate tax too. California doesn't have one, but it would be protecting these assets from those taxes. So I definitely think we would be exploring the different flavors of irrevocable trusts that are out there.
While we're talking, I'll just mention sort of what would we do, or what would a good wealth manager do with the client? Where would they start? And that is, first thing you want to do is a personal balance sheet. What are all the assets? Is the state tax, GST tax, is it even really a concern? How big of a client are there? Are there business interests? The next thing is before any gifting, as sort of what you might call a lifestyle analysis or cash flow analysis. Do they need this money? Is this money that we know beyond any doubt is going to end up going to children and grandchildren? And at that point, that's when you start planning, because if you're above those exemption amounts, it's not just that you're above it today, but all the future growth of your assets will be hit with that tax. So it means every dollar you make going forward while you're alive, the government is going to not only take income taxes from it when you're alive, but an additional 40% after you pass away. And not only that, that's 40% today. The estate tax, the gift tax, the GST tax, historically, let's say prior to 2001, estate taxes were 55 to 77%. So we don't know what the estate tax rate is even going to be when he passes away. And that's why we want to do some of this planning now, sooner rather than later. But to your point, and to transition, it's not just about taxes. It's not just about taxes. For a lot of our clients, even if it's not an estate tax issue or a GST tax issue, these trusts provide, and that'll be your next topic, is the topic of asset protection. And it's not that you don't trust your children. I mean, for all I know, the daughter is great, but there are certainly issues with Alan. In fact, the dad even admits it in the very beginning when they're driving off to Las Vegas, and Sid offers to his future son-in-law, he gives him his prized possession, this vintage mint condition Mercedes convertible, and his explicit instruction is don't let Alan drive because there's something wrong with him. So right off the bat, we know that you should be doing trust planning for Alan for asset protection just because he clearly has some issues. The dad is aware of it. But even if you trust the sister or his daughter, Tracy, what about trusting everyone else in the world? What about potential divorce? What about a potential car accident? So there's a lot of reasons for these trusts well beyond anything to do with the state or gift taxes. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Hans.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there's a number of family objectives that have nothing to do with tax. And really, as important as taxes are, I always tell my clients, it is equally or more important to make sure that the tax structuring and strategies fit within the context of your family goals. Because if you let the tax tail wag the dog, you may end up in a structure or many structures that actually don't work for your family. And yes, they may be tax efficient, but there may be practical considerations that just aren't a good fit. And so, absolutely right. The reason why these trusts work for asset protection is that if you structure the trust correctly, the assets are not technically owned for tax purposes or controlled by the beneficiary individually. So you mentioned Alan, the alternative to Sid doing any of this planning would be to leave assets to him perhaps outright at Sid's death. And we know that given Sid's concerns and about Alan, that probably would not be a good idea, despite the fact that he's an adult, because sometimes that's a concern because they're a minor and they're not of age yet. There would be some concerns here because Sid wouldn't probably want him to have full access, unfettered control over those assets. So going back to the asset protection point, Alan doesn't actually own these assets in his own name. There is a degree of creditor protection so that let's say Alan gets in trouble later. It might be because he's going back to Vegas and he's counting cards or he's getting into some other trouble where he's got a creditor after him. There is a degree of creditor protection because, again, if they're going to seek a judgment against him, these assets for his benefit are held in a trust and they're not in his own personal bank account or his own personal name or his own personal trust for that matter. Anything else you want to add on the asset protection point? I think we've sort of given a high-level overview of things that Sid and his family should consider. And certainly, if we assume that he is above the exemption amounts, seeking to make gifts and funding irrevocable trusts, it should be something they at least explore.
One of the reasons you want to work with good wealth managers and good attorneys is oftentimes what we see in trust documents, and this was the old traditional way of drafting, is that someone would have a trust for their children. And the trust would say something that like, oh, well, once they reach the age of 30, they'll get a third of the trust. And then 35, they'll get half of what's left. And 40, they'll get whatever's left in the trust. And the more modern way of drafting is moving away from that. And if you really want to provide that asset protection, as soon as the money leaves the trust, it's in their hands. It means it's potentially up for grabs in divorce or at least spousal support, things like that. It loses its creditor protection, especially if you have a child like Alan that you want to keep that protected. And what kills me as well is you've done this incredible estate tax planning, GST tax planning. As soon as it comes out of the trust, you lose it. It's gone. You don't get that GST protection anymore. I've seen GST trusts that have been drafted to go outright at certain ages. And you're like, why did you bother? Why did you waste such a valuable opportunity? So that's number one about keeping assets protected in trust, even for Tracy, even for the daughter. Even if you fully trust her, she's brilliant, all that kind of stuff. It's that you don't trust anyone else. Once it comes out and is distributed, it's in her own name, her own account, it's up for grabs. So that's number one. And then I'll throw in number two that kind of adds to our discussion, and that is the power of an independent trustee. This is a professional trustee. Often there's these great trust companies all around the country. I happen to work at one. But the reality is an independent trustee, that's what also adds to that asset protection. If you have a trust and let's say the child's the sole trustee of their own trust, they're an adult, and whenever they want money, they go in and they take money out and they've been living off of it. And the reality is in a divorce type situation or creditor situation, it's very likely the judge is just going to disregard that trust. You've been using it like your personal piggy bank. But if you have this independent third party there, who's at least keeping records, accountings, they are going to tell any judge in this country, I'm sorry, I cannot give any of this money out of the trust to anyone except for the named beneficiary, and they will fight it in court. And you will get that added protection. But it's another thing I see often is, why didn't you put in an independent trustee, or at the very least, a lot of corporate trustees are willing to be what's called a co-trustee. And that means that they would at least be there in addition to whatever individual you name. So you get the best of both worlds. You have a corporation and an individual making the decisions, but it does add to that asset protection.
There is this concept of an ascertainable standard that is important too. And, the magic words that we see are health, education, maintenance, support. Those are very key words, because if the standard of distribution is beyond that, then there's an argument that these assets should not be exempt and that should be pulled into a beneficiary's estate. And so there's that concept too that I've seen actually very recently blown in a trust document where, again, prepared by somebody else who, based on the plan, it seemed like it was very clear these assets and these trusts were intended to be exempt for more remote descendants, but they had this very broad distribution standard that used words like comfort, welfare, and things like that. So,
happiness.
Yes, happiness. Yeah.
The other mistake we sometimes see is a parent would say, oh, well, if it's going to stay in trust, I want my kid to decide where it goes after they die, which you can put in what's called a special or limited power of appointment, where they can, maybe they don't like all of the grandkids or something like that. But another mistake we see is what's called a general power of appointment, where the lawyer just says, oh, you know what, after the kid, in their will or with this power of appointment, that they can say they can give it to whoever they want after the child passes away. And that's called a general power of appointment. And the problem with that is you lose the GST protection.
Exactly.
And it kills me that, once again, it's unfortunate, but, not every lawyer out there should be working on high net worth estates if they don't really know what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And words matter. We're going to focus a little bit on Phil, Bradley Cooper's character, but I think they had just arrived in Vegas and everything was still on the up and up. And he said, I may never go back. I might just stay in Vegas, which is, we find out later he's married and he's got a son. And so hopefully he didn't mean that he was just going to stay there by himself. But this idea of just tax residency or domicile in Nevada specifically versus California is attractive to many clients of ours, because Nevada specifically does not have a state income tax, while California does, and a rather high one at that. And so often clients want to leave California. And I know Phil probably didn't say it for these reasons. I think he was just saying, how fun Vegas would be if you lived there permanently. But many clients often want to leave California for a state like Nevada with this goal of avoiding California's state income tax. And so I was going to very quickly just kind of run through just a definition of tax residency versus domicile for income tax purposes. So residency is one's legal status. It's based on their physical presence generally, such as living in a state for more than a certain number of days a year. Whereas domicile is more a subjective concept. It's based on one's intent to make a location your permanent home. And so things that will be looked at as evidence of that is, your driver's license. Where are you registered? Voter registration. Where do you own real estate? Where do you maintain your important personal and business relationships? So that's domicile. Unlike residency, you can only have one tax domicile at a time. And so it is completely possible, based on those definitions, to be a tax resident of one state while being domiciled in another. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we come across this all the time. I've got a ton of clients in Incline Village in Nevada. It's about as close as you can get. Very, very nice, expensive place to live, right past the border of California in Nevada. Clients that live outside Las Vegas as well. And the trick here is, and you mentioned the magic word domicile. Sometimes I like to say is domicile is where your heart is, which is somewhat touchy-feely. But the reality is, if you are going to try to avoid, California has a 13.3% state income tax rate, and it doesn't distinguish between dividends and capital gains. It's all at the potential highest rate of 13.3%. And that's a lot of money if you're selling your business, if you're retiring. And so we do see a lot of people before that. But in order to change your residence, let alone change your domicile, you can't just snap your fingers. It is very strict, and the Franchise Tax Board in California does like to, especially for wealthy people, question whether or not you've actually changed your residence and domicile. And so that means they will look all these factors that you mentioned, let's say having a driver's license or a bank account or what church or synagogue you're a member of, they're not all weighted equally. So let's say if you move to Las Vegas and you get a condo there that's 1,200 square feet, but you have a 6,000 square foot mansion in San Francisco, that's worth $15 million, and you're constantly going back and forth, and maybe your dog still lives in San Francisco, your kids are still here. If you've got that type of situation, it's unlikely that you've actually changed your residence for tax purposes. And so you just have to make sure if you're going to do it, it's totally possible. And you do it before you sell your business, before you retire, all that kind of stuff. But you've got to do it correctly. You have to have the facts on your side. And this is where good advisors can help.
That's right. Exactly right. We should mention that an exception to avoiding California income tax is that California will still continue to tax California source income, which typically includes rental income or capital gains from California-based real property, and also income that is derived from a California-based business. So you can do what you need to do, even if you successfully do it, to avoid state income tax in California. But if your income is coming from one of these sources, hence the term source income, then California will very likely still be able to tax it. And so the other reason that Nevada is often attractive for clients of ours in California is that a trust that's sited in Nevada, meaning it's established under Nevada law, can last for up to 365 years, which is significantly longer than what's permissible here in California. And so we talked about this, this GST exempt trust earlier. Wouldn't it be great if those trusts could continue to be exempt for multiple generations down the road? And so if you have a trust that can last up to 365 years, there are other states, by the way, that have an unlimited duration, or Nevada happens to be that number. That's beneficial because you're going to keep these assets in trust exempt where they don't have to be pushed out and into the beneficiary's hands at a predefined time. And so that is another reason why many of our clients end up seeking to establish trust in Nevada over California. And the theme here is you need to seek qualified professional help because there are things you need to do to make that strategy work properly as well. Not the least of which is finding a trustee that's in Nevada so that you can actually avail yourself of Nevada law. Anything you want to add on that before we move on?
Yeah, I think what you just said there is key in terms of trust planning, that you don't actually have to move to Nevada or you don't have to move out of California to take advantage of other states that have better trust law. And I can assure you with California, when it comes to planning for taxes, there are a lot of other states that have better trust law
right.
than California. So it doesn't have to be Nevada. There's Alaska, there's South Dakota, there's Wyoming, there's Tennessee, there's Florida. Delaware is another great one. We are a Delaware trust company. So any one of those states is going to be heads and tails better than California. You already mentioned rule against perpetuities, meaning these trusts can last in Nevada 365 years, and in Delaware they can last forever. But it's not just about that. It's about you get better asset protection. You also have the ability to do what are called sort of silent trusts, meaning maybe you don't want your kids and grandkids, at 18 years old, knowing that there's $10 million in a trust that's waiting for them. So there's a lot of bells and whistles that you get. You don't have to be a resident of those states. Not only that, and this is the class that you had to sit through. I'm glad you're still talking to me after 15 years. State income taxes. If, let's say, Sid sets this up for his kids and then passes away, well, what if his kids eventually move outside of California? Why would you continue to have a California trust with a California trustee paying taxes in California if the kids or grandkids don't live there anymore? So these are all reasons why doesn't have to be Nevada, Delaware, but basically anywhere almost other than California could be a better jurisdiction for future trust planning.
The next topic we wanted to cover very quickly is just the idea of disposing of someone's tangible personal property after death. And here we've got Stu's grandmother's Holocaust ring. At some point, Stu says, and I think when he marries Jade, and he obviously doesn't remember that he did this. So when we find out about it, he's also finding out about it kind of for the first time, where he's actually awake and alert. But he says, I can't believe I gave my grandmother's Holocaust ring to someone I just met. And so there's that item. And then you mentioned it earlier, there's Sid's 1965 Mercedes 220 SE Cabriolet. I think that's what it is. That's what the internet tells me, so I'm going with it. With tangible personal property, I think it's important, particularly for, things that are above just nominal value, right? Because everyone has just your clothing, your furniture. If you've got items, though, that have, especially when they're particularly valuable, or if you want to leave them with a specific person that you're passing, or perhaps within specific management instructions, it's important to have all of this dealt with in your estate plan rather than just sort of leaving it to chance. Some nice steps to take: creating an inventory of your valuable assets. You want to get it appraised by a qualified appraiser, because when we said earlier that someone's estate, as it measures up to their estate tax exemption, it does include their tangible personal property. So if you have a $1 million rare collectible car, and that's what its value is when you die, that would be important to know, because that would be subject potentially to estate tax because it's included in your estate. And as I mentioned, just providing clear instructions on who should inherit or manage that property in either your living trust or a will, at least, is very important. Any additional thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, and also, there's the ring, there's the car. In fact, it reminds me of there's the quote from the movie where Alan says, "My dad loves this car more than he loves."
That's right,
me.
More than me.
So we're talking about these prized possessions, and one of the things that I want to point out in personal property is so important. It's not just about the dollar value; it's about the emotional or psychological value. And you can have an attorney draft the greatest, best trust. It should be like framed. It was done perfectly. And oftentimes, what children or grandchildren fight over are these items of property, like who gets grandpa's watch, who gets mom's ring, who gets that specific painting. And these are often wealthy families, so there's plenty of money. So it's not the dollar figure per se, but it's these items of personal property, and it's so easy to address during life. So if you have children, you can just, as you mentioned earlier, just write it down. You can stick it in a safety deposit box. You don't have to tell them who you're leaving what, but just write it down on a piece of paper. You can sign it and hold on to it. So that way, at least the children, why would you give them, even if they get along while you're still alive, why would you give them something to fight over? So that's number one. Number two is, if you do all get along, then maybe you start talking to the next generation about what they want. It's a family. I know it's somewhat morbid, but the reality is we're all going to eventually pass away sometime. So why not kind of get a sense of, if you have 2 or 3 children or more, like, are there any specific items of property that are extra meaningful to them? And why don't you prevent a fight for after you're gone? You want to keep your children, if they get along now, don't you want to keep them getting along after you're gone? And so by not only writing it down, but sometimes talking to them before you pass away. And I'll even add one more thing as well, that it's just a little tidbit. Not everyone wants to do homework and add this to their list. But in addition to writing down, I want to leave, my ring to my oldest daughter or whatever it is, it's nice to add an extra statement of why. And that's all it takes. Even if it's just to say, because she's the oldest, maybe you could say, because she reminds me the most of my grandmother, and that's where I got this ring. Adding a little statement like that, I mean, the reality is you'll be dead at that point, but it just adds a little bit of, well, why did she leave this to you and not me? They can't argue with you if you're gone, but at the same time, writing it down and dealing with personal property while you're still alive, whether or not you decide to tell your kids or grandkids, can prevent so much fighting after you're gone.
Absolutely. Having a statement of wishes that is even, precatory in nature, right? Basically, you're not around anymore. You can't speak for yourself. And so anything you can do in terms of leaving a document or many documents that evidence your intention is going to probably help. So this next item is related, but it's digital assets. And Stu's digital camera got me thinking about this, because at the end of the movie, we know that's how we fill several of the gaps in the movie. Is we have this ending credits photo montage. And cleverly, they wove it in using Stu's digital camera that Alan finds in the back of the car or something like that. But the same way that we talked about taking appropriate steps to dispose of and also, ensure the proper succession of your tangible assets, probably very important in this day and age to do the same thing for your digital assets. So these are photos, videos. It can include email, social media, gaming accounts, cryptocurrency, if you've got rights to intellectual property, things that are not necessarily physical in nature. For the same reasons we mentioned above for your tangible assets, you want to do this for your digital assets. Your estate planning documents should at least contemplate authorizing a fiduciary, a trustee or executor to oversee and manage these digital assets. Anything you want to add to that? Because I think that that's something that probably people don't think about readily unless someone has $10 million in crypto. If it's just their normal, photos, videos and things, personal digital assets, I don't think they think as much about those. But as you mentioned, these are sentimental things and items, and it's often just as important to make sure that you've got a plan for those assets too.
Well, I'll just say, first of all, the pictures at the end of the movie, hopefully those don't exist anymore. I think it was Doug who said, we look at these pictures together, okay?
Yeah, just
one time, then we delete all the evidence. I think that's so hopefully you don't have that evidence anymore. But I think you bring up a great point, and we focus so much on the money. And don't get me wrong, the money is important. I think Zig Ziglar said it best. He said, money isn't the most important thing in life, but it's reasonably close to oxygen on the gotta have it scale. So we know the money is important. And yes, we are going to, as good advisors, will address the financial assets. But as you're pointing out, for a lot of the family members, nowadays, it's not about photo albums. They're all online. And the reality is a lot of online access, don't get me wrong, with whatever bank or wealth manager you're working with, you'll get online access as an executor or trustee. But who's going to get the photos? Who's going to be able to download? Who's going to be able to get into your computer if you haven't backed up these files, let alone the cloud? And so, like you said, it's not just that you own a ton of crypto and Bitcoin and Ethereum. It's some of these sentimental or psychological properties, digital assets that people want access to. And it's something you can address in your estate planning documents. But you also want to balance it with who are you giving that access to and how much access. Meaning in the olden days when we had envelopes or letters, maybe you kept a shoebox with some love letters. But now you give someone access to your email, they get every email you've ever sent. How many people are deleting their sent? So they can go back and they can look up their own name. What did you say about your mom or dad complaining to an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend or anything like that? So we just have to be careful that we want to provide some of this access, but we should be careful too about how much access we're providing to some of our future trustees and executors.
Right. Exactly. Great point. These next several topics here, I've introduced previously in the Mamma Mia and Love Actually episodes. Please listen to those if you want a more, detailed definition and context for these topics. Our quick discussion here is going to assume at least a basic understanding of some of these principles. But these next three topics, we're kind of talk about them all together, but it's this idea of these characters in this movie entering into either a cohabitation agreement, a premarital agreement, or a post-marital agreement. And so with the cohabitation agreement, I focused on Melissa and Stu. I think that based on what we've seen on screen in this movie, assuming both parties will agree to enter one, they seem to be prime candidates for a cohabitation agreement, just to spell out their agreements regarding their financial support, any property division if their relationship ends, and we know it ends, right? I mean, I would question Stu's judgment to end the relationship at one of his best friend's weddings, but we know it does end. I think we also learned that they've been together for 3 years. Presumably, they've been living together for at least a good portion of not all that time. What the red flags to me here are particularly that this relationship appears to be built on a lot of dishonesty and a severe lack of trust between the two of them. So throughout the entire movie, Stu is lying to Melissa about where he is. I mean, she thinks he's in Napa at a wine tasting. It's just crazy. We find out at that hotel check-in scene that Melissa's checking not only his credit card statements, but later I think we find out she's checking his bank statements. So that's the reason he doesn't want to charge the room to his card initially. A lot of lack of trust between them. While they're on relatively good terms, I think it would have been smart for them to enter into a cohabitation agreement to spell out what would happen. Anything to add to that one?
Yeah, well, bring out, so cohabitation, this is very state specific. But especially in California. So California does not have common law marriage. If you stay together a certain amount of years, you're not going to be suddenly deemed to be husband and wife or spouses if you're same gender marriages. But what California does have in it, it goes back to this case, Marvin v. Marvin. And the idea is, even if you're not married, let's say in the case of Stu, who's a dentist, if his girlfriend had, let's say, given up her job or career to stay and take care of the house, even though they're not married, she can have claims against Stu for breaking up with her and kicking her out of the house. She's not, and that's where the Marvin rights come in California. And it's very important to remind clients. So we have on both sides, we have men and women that are very successful executives, founders, you name it. And they think that they don't have to worry about premarital agreements because they're not married and they've been living with the same person oftentimes for years. And by not having a cohabitation agreement, they're setting themselves up for potential liability. That if they ever do break up, it's not like you can just, clap your hands and say, I'm done. We're not married, so you don't get anything. In California, you live together for several years. You're facing a potential contractual claim. And it doesn't go through family law court because you're not married. It goes through the regular court system. So your idea of this cohabitation agreement for anyone that has wealth that's living with someone, especially long-term, you should strongly consider this concept of a cohabitation agreement.
That's right. And along the same lines, for example, Tracy and Doug, we know that they're going to be married. They would be wise to enter into a premarital agreement. I don't know that we get too much sense of what Doug does or what type of wealth he might come from, but certainly on Sid's side, if we carry forth our assumptions that he's a high net worth individual and family, I would imagine he would probably want Tracy to enter into a premarital agreement to at least protect her separate property from Doug should they separate or divorce. Lastly, on this topic, a post-marital agreement, I want just quickly say that for Jade and Stu, who get married at the Best Little Chapel, even though they got married and they obviously didn't have time to think about a premarital agreement. I mean, it was sort of a shotgun wedding. They had just met. It's still possible to enter into a marital agreement. It would just be a post-marital agreement. We have a pretty clear understanding that Stu has quite a bit more separate property assets than Jade does. He's got, at least a dental practice. Nonetheless, if he and Jade both would agree, I think it would be wise for them to enter into the post-marital agreement should they stay together.
Let me add to that, and that is, and I think you mentioned, we don't know if Tracy or Doug, who are getting married, we don't know if they have any assets. So at first blush, they might think, why do we need a premarital? Neither of us has anything. But the key here, and this gets back into the fact of Sid's wealth, and let's assume Sid is very wealthy. Not only do we want Sid to do trust planning for his children, but if you really want to protect those assets in a divorce, that means that Tracy needs that prenup. And that's where, in going into it, Doug can actually say, I'm going to waive any right to your inheritance. It's not that he could even just get his hands on the inheritance, because that would be her separate property in California. If they don't have that prenup, then in theory, Doug could one day argue, well, I know I can't touch your separate assets in terms of splitting up the marital estate, but I certainly can ask you for spousal support. I want you to pay me, and it's just a matter of California law. It almost looks at it in fairness. If one day Tracy inherits $40 million, then Doug is going to ask for support based on the fact that she has $40 million unless there's a prenup in place. But you've got to do it correctly. And this is the key, once again, getting back into good advisors. And that is, you can't, first of all, each future spouse has to have their own attorney.
That's right.
The other thing is a time period as well. This isn't something, it's almost too late. By the time we're watching this movie, they're on their way to the bachelor party. They're about to get married. There's a rule in California. It's a 7-day rule that you've got to do this in advance. And you also have to have disclosure, meaning Doug can't just waive, Tracy might inherit something and I'm going to waive my right to that. Instead, you actually have to disclose. It doesn't necessarily mean, at least in California, you have to give the dollar figure. Hey, here's Sid's balance sheet. But you do have to fully disclose that there could be tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars that Tracy may inherit down the road. You should at least give a concept that there is substantial wealth outside of Tracy that she may inherit, whether directly or through trust. And I want to point out if we have one more minute, I'll at least point out an interesting background on the 7-day rule, only because it relates to Las Vegas, is there was a case dealing with, and this gets involved with the eloping in Vegas, and it was Barry Bonds who was getting married and got married and eventually got divorced, and his wife, in the middle of as they're getting divorced, was arguing, this is an invalid prenup. We signed it right before we eloped in Las Vegas. And at the time, under previous California law, the judge basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, hey, it's not like he came to you with this prenup right when you're about to have this huge wedding that's been planned in advance with all your friends. You decided to elope. You could have just waited another week or two and gotten an attorney and reviewed this prenup. And in that case, Barry Bonds actually won. She lost under the old California law. So what happened? They actually changed California law. Mm-hmm. So now we do have this day requirement of how far in advance you have to get the information. You need different attorneys. And by the way, it also means Sid can't pay for Doug's attorney. He has to hire his attorney. It's the way we avoid conflicts of interest. But I think it's the last key topic that I'm glad you brought it up. And that is, for anyone getting married, especially if there's not only you have wealth, but your family has wealth, please consider premarital planning.
Exactly. For the sake of time, I was going to talk about adoption really quickly. Just if Stu ultimately chooses to legally adopt Carlos, because under California law, a stepchild generally does not inherit as an heir of a step parent unless certain specific requirements are met. And so if Stu wanted to provide for Carlos, he could just make that explicitly clear. One way to do so would to adopt him and then to include him in his estate plan. And you pointed this out, naming guardians for baby Carlos. If Stu does adopt Carlos, I think he'd be wise, along with Jade, to not name any of his friends as guardians for Carlos, given their lack of judgment. You pointed out this quote from the movie. Phil says when they're leaving, I think it's when they're leaving baby Carlos in the car, when they're entering the best little chapel, And they said, I don't think we can leave him alone in the car. And he goes, he'll be fine. I cracked the window, which is really scary. It's sort of only funny in the movie. But it would be important, to name guardians for baby Carlos should Stu and or Jade not be around, to give him care both physically and financially. And then lastly, advanced healthcare directive. Everybody should at least have their advanced healthcare directive done, and that would be done as part of any foundational core estate plan. But this movie sort of points out situations that would come in handy, because Phil's hospital visit, for example, we found out he had a concussion. And so I think it was just a minor one, but let's say it wasn't a minor one and it was a major one. And he needs healthcare for himself, but, can't make those decisions himself. An agent under his healthcare directive could make those decisions for him. And then Stu, Phil, and Alan, we also know, are incapacitated by that stun gun during that demonstration. If they then, for example, suffered cardiac arrest or some serious health issue because of that, hopefully they would have had somebody there, right, with the agency to actually make decisions for them, because obviously they would not have the well-being to do it for themselves. So anything you'd like to quickly add to those three topics?
Well, certainly your last one is always key. Everyone should have their advanced healthcare directive. That's part of your basic planning documents. But the guardians comment, let alone adoption, it's huge. I think the ironic thing for the fact that Phil's the one that's saying, oh, just leave him in the car, I cracked the window. In the very beginning, in the first scene where they find the baby, he was going to leave the baby
exactly
with the tiger. And by the way, the irony of all this is Phil is the only one there who's not only married, but he has a kid.
That's right. So
clearly, I don't think he would be your top pick for guardian, but picking guardians is a very important part if you have minor children, who, and the reality is also over time, your choices may change. That's the other reason why you want to revisit some of these decisions that, when your kid's 3 or 4 years old, maybe you name your parents, maybe those are the best people, but when your child's, let's say 14, 15 years old in high school, a lot can change. Maybe your parents are older at that point. They're not the best fit. Maybe you want to keep them in the same high school if anything happens to you. So these are really all important things to check out and make sure that you check off your list, that you've got to get these into your documents. You don't want people going to court to fight over your minor children. And with that, I just want to make sure that everybody is sort of not only the advanced healthcare directive, but minor children, who's going to take care of them if anything ever happens to you.
Well, let's get to our verdict. I think we both know what our verdict is for this movie, but so the verdict is, if you say guilty, you enjoyed the movie, but feel guilty about it for any reason. Not guilty, you either disliked the movie or loved it. So in either case, it can't possibly be a guilty pleasure. For me, definitely not guilty. I enjoyed it. I rewatched it and feel the same way. How about you?
I'm with you on this one. Not guilty. I'm not embarrassed. The fact that if my wife and children like this movie too, and what's great, it had been years since I'd seen it. So if anything, thank you for a good excuse to rewatch the movie. It's fun. And I don't think we have to, feel guilty about watching it, because it clearly was at the time one of the most popular R-rated comedy ever when it came out. And at the same time, I think there are a lot of people that would agree with us. It's just a generally great movie. We don't have to get into Hangover 2 or 3. They aren't quite as loved, but at least the original Hangover, I think, is legendary.
Yeah, agreed. I tend to just pretend those other two don't exist in this universe. But yeah, what we've learned today is that even if all you're looking for is a fun weekend in Las Vegas, where you somehow end up with Mike Tyson's Tiger, it is important to engage qualified tax and legal advisors to help you and your family achieve income, gift, estate, and GST tax efficiency, asset protection, and other legal safeguards. Well, Justin, thanks again for joining me. I had a great time. Hope you did as well. And let's plan to do this again soon.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Hans, for having me on the podcast today.
I'm Hans Young with my guest, Justin Miller, a partner and national director of wealth planning at Evercore Wealth Management and Evercore Trust Company. And you've been listening to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farrell, Braun & Martel. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep watching movies.